Alright, now on to the remakes. As we all know, Like a Dragon Kiwami was the first of two remakes of the original PS2 titles, featuring a new combat system from its original counterpart, upscaled cutscenes, and even some brand new ones. Like a Dragon Kiwami serves as an evolution of the OG cult classic, delivering a fresh, modern take on the game, while simultaneously keeping those same fundamentals that it was known for. I personally can't make any quality comparisons, as I have not played the original version. I would more than love to, but hey, guess I could just wish for luck in finding a good copy. Anyway, I will have to judge this as a standalone product and by its own merits. And as a standalone product, is it any good? Well, I do think it's solid overall, I guess, but to be honest, I really have a better relationship with this game. One that has progressively soured with the 3 times I've beaten its main story. It's okay, but I really don't think I like it all that much. I mean, like any game, it has its good qualities and its really fucking bad qualities, so why don't I just get into them already? Why don't I start off with the combat first, because, you know, when haven't I done that? Anywho, if you enjoyed Like a Dragon Zero's combat like I did, well then, you're gonna love Kiwami's combat because it is literally the exact same thing. The big difference is that they added the dragon style, which I think is supposed to be the original's combat system, but with some new mechanics added in. I don't know, but I'll get to that style later. And outside of that addition and making Rush style broken as all hell, Kiwami's combat is basically a carbon copy of Zero's, and whether or not that's a bad thing is really up to you. Personally, I love Zero's combat system a lot. You all know this by now. So having another game that uses the same one is pretty neat, but having said that, I can't help but feel like it's kinda lazy. I mean, I don't mean to be rude or anything, but still. I mean, like, retaining the same style of combat between 2 games is one thing. Hell, the Judgment games use the same fighting styles, but they added in new mechanics and tweaked others to keep it from feeling like a blatant rehash. But when you're just simply copying and pasting one game's combat onto another with very minimal changes, it just feels rushed. No pun intended. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to stolen assets from Zero. Like, there are so many things in this game that are just straight up ripped from Zero. They are just a carbon copy, and it is so obvious. Like, for instance, the funeral escape blonde battle in Chapter 3, that's literally just a Tojo HQ escape from Zero. You know, the one with Tachibana and Oda. Yes, it is the exact same thing. Same enemies, same annoying couch dudes, same everything. And not only that, but some of the bosses in this game have the exact same movesets as some of the ones you countered in. Yep, you guessed it. Zero. Futoshi Shimano, for instance, is the worst example, because he's just literally Mr. Shakedown, but weak as fuck. And then there's the Akai brothers, who are just the Breaker and Beast styles. And even some of the QuickTime events were legit ripped from Zero. Like, what the hell is this game supposed to be? Is this supposed to be a remake of the first game, or just Zero with a different story? But hey, Kiwami had to introduce some new mechanics, right? I mean, there's no way that it couldn't have, right? Well, yeah, I guess it does bring some new stuff to the table, but the problem is that they're kind of awful. Go figure. The shit they did add were poor design choices that are absolutely frustrating in the worst of ways. Like, you cannot sit here and tell me that the boss regen mechanic was a good idea. Yes, I know it's a heat action that prevents them from healing, but still, no other game in the series had bosses healing. It's more of a pointless hindrance than anything. And about the bosses, oh my god, fuck the bosses to hell and back. Every single one in this game, basically, aside from 3 that I can think of off the top of my head, are all a certified stinker. And a lot of them really just showcase the general issues with the game, such as the perma-blocking and the absurd amount of knockdown their attacks have. But the biggest issue I had with these boss fights is that most of them have you cramped in a small arena with at least a dozen enemies attacking you all at once, sometimes with weapons. The Shindo boss fight is by far the worst example of this. Let me give you a scenario. For those of you who haven't played the game, let me paint a little picture for you. Imagine being stuck in a tiny alleyway. It had to be like 8 feet in width. And you were constantly getting gangbanged over and over again by about 8, maybe 10 people, around that much. And since they all have either swords or knives, every single attack will stun you. And this is relatively early in the game, so you won't have upgrades that, nullify bladed damage. So yeah, does that sound like fun to you? Like, at all? No, it's not. And if you think so, go check into a mental hospital. Seriously, it's so frustrating. And there are so many fights that are like this. The gambler fight, the RSA fight, even though he's not so bad on his own. And of course, there's the infamous Bingu fight that has become pretty notorious amongst the community for being one of the worst, if not the worst, fights in the entire franchise. My personal least favorite fight in this entire game has to go to the aforementioned Shimano fight in Chapter 3. Hands fucking down, no question. I already mentioned that his moveset was just stolen from Mr. Shakedown, but since the fight occurs so early in the game, like Chapter 3, literally just the 3rd chapter, you won't have nearly enough tools to make it at least a worthwhile fight. And it's just an agonizing experience. Really, your only option is just use Rush, land a few attacks to do chip damage, run away from his attacks, rinse and repeat until his health gets whittled down to the very last drop. It's not a hard fight per se, it's just so fucking repetitive, tedious, and just plain boring. Yeah, aside from Majima, Laukalan, and Nishiki, the boss lineup in this game just sucks ass. I just feel like I'm biding my time with each of them, aside from the few I actually did enjoy. And can we please take a moment to talk about some of the jankiness in this game? Seriously, if I had $1 for every time I was stun locked from getting flicked, knocked down mid-combo because some bosses will randomly break through my attacks with no rhyme or reason as to when or how, or I get completely fucked over thanks to the heat actions just straight up not working sometimes, I could buy all of Michael Jackson's catalog. Miracle Johnson's catalog. God, this really is one of those games that will have you spiking your controller into the ground. And about that last point, there is this incredibly obnoxious fight in Stardust, where several enemies had guns, and I swear to God, the Komaki shot stopper just would not work. The Kiwami heat action, the ones that prevents bosses from healing, just didn't trigger at times either. I have enough heat, damn it, why won't it work? I really can't help but feel like this game was just a tech demo over Zero, when in fact this was supposedly going to be a tune-up from what I can observe. It's hilarious and sadly ironic, because Kiwami 2 would actually improve upon 6's combat, where Kiwami 1's case was the exact opposite. You know what, I'm done. I just want to talk about the good stuff. The good stuff that is there, because there is some good stuff. And with that being said, the good stuff in this game is really good. I know I've made this statement a dozen times already, but the combat is the same as Zero's, so there will obviously be plenty of fun to be had with that. So everything I said regarding the brutality, the variety, and some of the surprising amount of nuance of Zero's combat system can be said about this game as well. And I'm gonna be brutally honest, I actually like Kiwami's progression system over Zero's. Having to use currency to buy upgrades was a little annoying, so Kiwami definitely took a better approach by implementing a more standard XP based system, like in the original game. You finally don't have to grind through those training missions to get the cool moves anymore, unless we're talking about the Komaki actions of course, which is another teeny tiny step up. And finally, unlike in Zero, you can actually upgrade your heat gauge this time. Kiwami made damn near no good changes compared to Zero, but this one particular change was one of the very few things that dragged Zero down a bit. And regarding the changes that were made, there is one big change that I have neglected to mention until now, and that is the Majima Everywhere system. I have very mixed feelings about this feature, though most of my gripes with it stem from its portrayal of Majima, so that criticism wouldn't really fit in this category. Anyway, the concept of Majima Everywhere is simple enough. You encounter him through various wacky methods of his, you beat him to a pulp, and you gradually unlock more moves for the dragon style as you go. Cool, right? Seems like a nifty little way of getting abilities. But the main issue I had with the system is that it's, for lack of a better word, grindy. It's cool at first, but the more you encounter Majima, the more he starts to feel like a glorified street battle. Majima does have those same 3 styles he used in Zero, but about 3/4 of the time he just uses Thug, so the fights will eventually start to feel extremely repetitive. And also, this is Goro Majima we're talking about. He is damn near close to being Kiryu's equal in terms of fighting skills. So why in the hell is he such a pussy? Hey, here's an idea. Why not have his fights get harder as you progress through this little ranking thing? Not only will it feel like less of a chore, but it'll feel much more rewarding to earn those upgrades. Instead, all I feel when I hear that Kiryu-chan echoing throughout Kamurocho is just, well, looks like I'm gonna fight this guy again. Majima does pull some crazy shit sometimes, like posing as a stripper, or unleashing a literal zombie invasion, but fights like that are just too few and far in between to keep me truly invested in this minigame. But the biggest issue I had with this Majima Everywhere system is how it portrays his character. Every fan of this series knows that despite being a ludicrous anti-hero with questionable methods and antics, he's still a pretty deep character inside, which was clearly shown in games such as 0 and 4. So here we have Majima Everywhere, something that makes him look like a fucking wacky meme man. It's just an insult to his character. I don't care if I'm over-exaggerating, it just is. And in some cases, this system actually interferes with the main story and messes with the pacing. Take the sequence in Chapter 11 for instance, where Kiryu must venture to the Shangri-La, the Soapland, but not before Majima invites you to the docks, where he is subsequently fought and shot and falls into the river. You then go to Shangri-La like you're supposed to, immediately afterwards, only to fight Majima again. Completely fine, not like he got shot or anything. Like, what? What? Way to just throw in some completely unnecessary garbage that hardly makes any sense, but anyway, whatever. How's the rest of the story then? Well, the signature emotionally invested writing of Like a Dragon is still definitely present, but however, I feel that the story, while not awful or anything, is probably the most boring one in the franchise. Not hard to believe since this is a remake of the very first game, so they were still working some things out with the writing. But the story still does suffer from some underdeveloped characters and even some slight pacing issues here and there. A lot of the characters that were in Zero were featured in this game as well, and honestly, this game had better be damn thankful for Zero's existence, because without it, I wouldn't nearly have as much investment in these characters. If I had missed the brotherly dynamics between Kiryu and Nishiki in Zero, their relationship wouldn't really have meant as much to me, and Nishiki's sacrifice at the end wouldn't have had nearly as much impact. If it wasn't for Kiryu's dedication to clearing Kazuma's name in Zero, their bond would have felt kinda in existence, and the sacrificial statement with Nishiki applies here as well. And if it wasn't for Shinji's sub-stories in Zero, I really would not have cared about him nearly as much. Same applies to Reina, except for, that she didn't have any sub-stories, but whatever. And all of this really begs the question of whether or not you should view Kiwami as a remake of the first game, or just a sequel to Zero. Really, if it weren't for the stellar character writing in Zero, then a lot of the shit in Kiwami would just feel, like, this just exists. It's a thing, I guess. But for all of its shortcomings, I did appreciate how Kiwami added roughly 30 minutes of brand new cutscenes that showcases Nishiki's ascent into villainy. From what I have seen from the original game, Nishiki only showed up in the beginning, the final chapter, and like twice in between that, so I was a rather underdeveloped antagonist. Thankfully, Kiwami gives us a little more insight into how he lost his sanity and eventually became arguably the greatest villain in the entire series. Hell, I can even say I almost sympathize with Nishiki, just because of all the bullshit he went through. I mean, his oath brother got sent to prison for an entire decade, his other childhood friend straight up lost their memory via trauma, he was constantly getting scolded by his peers for being Kiryu's inferior, and to top it all off, his sister dies of an illness despite how hard he tried to raise enough money to treat it. Poor guy. And I think this strongly highlights the brutal fact that even some of the nicest people in the world can just lose all touch with reality as a result of the cruelty you're surrounded by. This was one of the best things about Kiwami, and I'm more than glad that these extra cutscenes were added in. But as its own thing, Kiwami's story is fairly decent, I guess. A lot of the characters aside from Mishiki would have felt underdeveloped if it weren't for Zero. There's a few gripes I have with some things like pacing and plot devices, fucking florist. But overall, Kiwami has a pretty alright story. One of the weakest in the series, but still decent as a whole. Since this game uses the exact same engine as Zero, everything I mentioned about the game's graphics applies to Kiwami as well. So all of the goofy looking NPCs are here as well, with the good old peanut butter looking hair. So with that in mind, does that mean Kiwami is going to receive the exact same score as Zero's graphics? Nope. And that's because of one very big, very ugly reason. The cutscenes are actually very different from Zero's, which is a nice way of saying that they look like ass. Kiwami updates the original cutscenes of the original game by upscaling them so they're on par with Zero's art style. But the problem is that they just simply redid the originals frame by frame, so all the janky facial expressions and mouth movements of the PS2 version still remain. And it looks jarring as hell, especially during close-ups. And it looks even more jarring next to the brand new cutscenes that very clearly look a lot better. Like seriously, it's such a whiplash in quality. This is like that CGI intro in Sonic 06, and then it goes right into the gameplay afterwards, and you're just like, oh my good god. I just don't get it. I really don't. They retranslated the entire game, revoiced the entire script, added new content and new cutscenes, yet they couldn't just tweak the animation of the original cutscenes so that it didn't look uncanny. So while the game during combat and such looks just as good as Zero did, the cutscenes were just a massive drawback for me. Now obviously, since this is the full remake of the original Like a Dragon, that means all of the songs from the first game got remixed, and there are a few new tracks as well, such as Flirt with Bomb. And from my knowledge, remixes are really never as good as their original counterparts, and the same can be said about Kiwami as well. Not like it's super bad or anything, I just think it misses the point of what made the original soundtrack as good as it was. See, the original soundtrack had this really grungy, badass feel to it that consisted of heavy guitar riffs, drum and bass style production, and plenty of hip-hop vocal samples. It's not only hard as hell, and somewhat even unique, but it really captured the grimy urban aesthetic of the game. Enter Kiwami, where it just sounds like every other video game soundtrack these days, as the focus is more on these overblown electronic elements, featuring less guitar riffs and less of that awesome grunginess, and opting for more buzzy synthesizers and pretty flat percussion. Seriously, the drums on this synth sound weak. But the overall issue with Kiwami's remixes is that they just lack the dynamics and the aesthetic of the original. I will say that some of the remixes, such as Pray Me and Vertical Point, are better than the original, but Intelligence for Violence, Scarlet Star, Funk Goes On, yeah, the original just beats Kiwami's OST into the ground. Again, Kiwami's soundtrack isn't horrible, it just pales in comparison to the original, and you'd be better off listening to that instead. Also, very slight little nitpick if you want to call it that. Why doesn't this game have a feature where you can swap between the original and remastered soundtracks? Like, so far, off the top of my head, every single remaster I've ever played has that feature. But not this for some reason. That just confuses me. And it disappoints me. But hey, you know, whatever. It is what it is. It's crazy how this franchise went from one of the most jam-packed games to the most minuscule game in terms of content. Kiwami removed basically every minigame featured in Zero, except for some reason, shit like Shogi, Mahjong, and the stupid catfights, who have now been replaced with this weird bug lady thing that's in the arcade for some reason. I don't know. I didn't really play it at all, neither did I play the catfights. And before you say anything, no, I didn't really expect Kiwami to bring back all the content from Zero, but damn it, at least give us something other than the most basic ass shit that hardly any of the fans enjoy. Hell, Kiwami 2 was able to introduce new things like the bouncer missions, street bosses, this weird photo shooting minigame that confuses me even more than the cat fights. Anyway, I can't really think of anything that Kiwami had to offer outside of Majima Everywhere, which, like I said before, really isn't that good. I shouldn't really complain about the sub-stories since they did come from the very first game after all. Most of them are still pretty damn boring. Oh no, Kiryu got scanned for the millionth time. Oh no. So yeah, pretty horseshit amount of content all around. For the average game, yeah, it's got a lot to offer, but considering this is like a Dragon we're talking about, it's just so disappointingly underwhelming. Basically everything I've already said about Zero can be said about this game as well. 60 FPS, some stuttering during hub worlds, and some texture pop-ins. Though I had some gripes with how broken some of the boss fights were, but I already explained that during the gameplay segment. Moving on. Ugh. I honestly wouldn't give this one another playthrough. I mean, if you really want to, then by all means go for it. But I genuinely cannot see myself playing through this game's main story again. Maybe I will once I fully upgrade the Dragon style, because I heard the game gets seriously fun once that happens. But for the time being, I seriously don't want to suffer through the most aggravating set of boss fights, some of the really shitty padded moments, and of course, that god fucking awful car chase battle. God damn it, I hate that thing. And I highly recommend you avoid an extra playthrough of this game as well. You know, save yourself the pain and the humiliation. Apologies for the mostly hostile review, but my god, Like a Dragon Kiwami was such an egregious experience, all things considered. The combat is a copy and paste from Zero, the boss fights are obnoxious as hell, the story struggles to stand on its own, the content is underwhelming. Yeah, Kiwami was just not the best game I've ever played. But is it really the worst game in the franchise? Well, I won't spoil anything for y'all yet, but just know that there's a particular game later on that I'm going to be even harsher towards. And I cannot wait for that moment. I just cannot wait to rip that game to shreds. Ooh. But still, having said everything I've said throughout the entire video, I still think Kiwami is worth checking out for the sake of getting the full Dragon of Dojima experience. I would seriously just play the game on normal difficulty. Not because I'm a scrub or anything, but it'll save you from the absolute torment I went through playing this game on hard. Can't even imagine what Legend difficulty is like. Anyway, Kiwami isn't so much a bad game, as it's more of a game I would call mid. Yeah, I think that about describes it. Like a Dragon Kiwami is pretty fucking mid.